thank you. When we tried to look sort of below the surface to dig a bit deeper, albeit in a fairly small pool, what did we find? Some of what we found, I think, has already been reflected in the polling data that we've just heard about. So across all 4 of the workshops, which were held around Scotland and England, we did see kind of this support for the principle of giving assistance to developing countries, was still there. And it was often underpinned by a kind of moral value, the moral commitment. So we have a quote here from Edinburgh, I hope you can all see, which says, every child deserves a good, healthy upbringing. Every child deserves an education, even the simplest things they deserve. And we found this was often articulated by people in each of the groups in terms of fairness, a sense of doing the right thing. And that often came up much more strongly in the groups that we were looking at than, for example, arguments about self-interest. And what we often saw was that when the kind of self-interest case was raised by 1 or 2 individuals, what's in it for us, often the group would sort of dismiss that and say, well, no, we don't think that's really what this is about. We think this is about, a moral commitment, fairness, and so on. But we certainly also saw, and this came up across all of the workshops, in fact, it was stronger in some than in others, that is tempered by people's reflections on what's happening at home. And again, this is picked up by the polling data more broadly as well. So we saw a lot of people reflecting, well, charity should be beginning at home. We have our own problems. We should be prioritising. What are the trade-offs which are there? And I think, partly this is the financial crisis. I think partly, as Spencer was saying, we did see quite a lot of language when we did the sort of discourse analysis of us versus them, and a sense of separation between our own experiences and our own experiences of poverty and them and their experiences, which I think can be quite problematic. So we have this kind of balanced picture. Well, there's a moral case, but people are also worried about what's happening at home. And that kind of makes sense because of what we know is happening in terms of the financial crisis and so on. But actually, what we found is sort of digging a bit deeper and listening rather than asking particular questions. You also started to see some other dynamics emerging, which we think are not picked up in opinion polling data to date, and I think which we could reflect on and perhaps think about how we further test. So first of all, when we looked at some of the opinion poll data, and I think this goes back to Joe's points about who's asking the question and why, I think we often see that international aid and development are often mixed up and used a bit interchangeably, and that can confuse things. I think it can confuse what we're getting back from people. And actually, when we just let conversations flow and we listened in, what we saw is that people do seem to be distinguishing between development and aid. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think it's certainly the case that, the kind of citizens that we were listening to don't use the word development. We know that's not a word that reaches much beyond this particular sector in this context, but they did seem to be describing sort of longer term processes through which change happens. And there's a quote here from Edinburgh, people talking about education, about infrastructure. Some people talked about political change that needs to happen. And this was often viewed more positively, right? So, the kind of positive process of change which can happen around the world. When the conversation moved to talk about aid, we saw something quite different, and we often saw more negative language being used and more negative kind of tone to the discussion. I should say that we also saw quite a lot of confusion. Were we talking about UK government aid? Were people talking about charitable giving? Were they talking about other forms of aid? I think terms are not always clearly understood. But yeah, so aid in general, when it was discussed much more negatively. We thought maybe you'd see issues of corruption coming out, which come out a lot in, I think, the media debate. Actually, when not prompted, they didn't come through so strongly, but waste and inefficiency did, which I think is also picked up in the polling that Spencer talked about. And interestingly, what seemed to underlie the discussion about waste was actually people's sense that little seems to be substantively changing over the last few decades in developing countries, which is interesting because we all, those of us working on these issues know how much change is happening in different parts of the world. And Live Aid came up in all of the workshops. We have a quote here from someone in Evesham who said, well, I was around when Live Aid shocked everybody, and still the problem hasn't been sorted. We're still giving to charities, doing our stuff. It's still happening. You know, this does show the extent to which these kinds of big events can resonate, but I think they can also show the extent to which unwittingly we may be reinforcing a sense of little having changed when these sorts of things are seen to be repeated. And there was a real recognition often by people in the groups. They don't really believe that it's money alone which is the solution to the sorts of problems you're talking about when you're talking about issues in developing countries. So someone in London remarked, well, with all this aid or charity or donations, we need some kind of projected view. How long is it going to go on? When will they become self-sufficient? Then you'll get these people out of poverty. You cannot just keep on giving. And I think there's probably lots of different things which underlie some of this, but particularly by analysing sort of the language people were using and the things they were describing around this issue, what seemed to come out of our workshops was that actually people are reflecting back the sorts of messaging, the sorts of imagery that they feel they get on these issues from different sources. And we didn't look at specific campaigns or specific organisations, but I think there was a general sense from the discussions that actually particular fundraising efforts, particular campaign strategies, particular efforts perhaps to shore up support for UK aid spending more broadly, you know, are important and may have been quite effective, but actually can be also impacting on the wider climate of public opinion in ways that I think we need to be paying attention to. So, as I said, unprompted, participants in all of our workshops made repeated references actually to feeling pretty exploited by the kinds of images, the kinds of messages that they feel they receive in relation to international aid and development. So there's some examples here from London and from Edinburgh of people saying very explicitly that they feel exploited and that actually they feel they see the same kinds of images over and over again, and eventually it leads them to want to turn away. Now, you know, there's partly here, I think, feelings of sort of guilt, of wanting to distance yourself from the magnitude of problems. But actually what was striking was that people were quite frustrated by what they saw as the kind of shallowness, both of their own understanding, but also of the kind of the message or the story that they're being told. And I think that might be part of what's playing out in some of this sort of rejection or growing skepticism that we're seeing as well. So we've got some kind of mixed findings, and there's more in our report which is available in the lobby and also online, and which will give you more detail. But I think actually the key take home for us was that actually, despite some of these challenges, there is still a real appetite for better information and for a better understanding about how change happens around the world. And we characterize this as really a sort of an openness to understanding progress, to understanding where change is possible, where change is happening, but also process, how change happens. And I think what we do tend to see when we look at predominant ways of communicating in this area, we see a lot of attention on inputs, you know, money spent, money going in, and on outputs, on people, you know, children in school, on people taking out of poverty. We don't actually, and I think we're all probably not very good at communicating what happens in between and what are all of the different factors that need to come together to contribute to effective change, not just aid. When we kind of introduced some information that gave more, which gave information on kind of where progress had been achieved and where improvement had happened, people responded quite positively. But they also, again, unprompted, asked for information on, if you like, sort of exit strategies. They felt they weren't often told when communities or countries no longer needed aid because they had been able to graduate out of that need, and that should be something which should be celebrated and championed as a sign of success, and that they were kind of asking, well, why are we not told about that? Why do we not hear about that? So I think this does give us real food for thought. I mean, it's not representative in the way that opinion poll data is. It's a fairly small sample and just some kind of in-depth reflections from people at a particular point in time. But we think it does offer some food for thought. It tells us perhaps there's dissatisfaction with with what people perceive to be as a fairly simple aid story that they're told. And I think there are some quick wins here about how we could address some of the worst of that in terms of choices of images and language in campaigns and messaging. But also actually this sense of actual more openness than perhaps we had realised, for a kind of more complex understanding, perhaps for a reflection on the costs and the benefits in this area. But people kind of they want the story to change, I think, around aid and development, and they want to be given this kind of richer, fuller understanding about these issues. We have more recommendations on this in our report, aimed at different stakeholders to take this forward. But we hope that gives you some insights into the kinds of things that we think a sort of a different approach can offer.